Good evening, everyone. I'm Dhvani Mehta from the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the fourth conversation in our series, Law with a Difference, which we are co-hosting with our digital partner, The Print. This series discusses legal and governance reform ideas in Vidhi's briefing book for 2020. Here's a copy of the book, and you should have a link to the book appear in the chat box as well. So every year, Vidhi publishes a briefing book that contains 25 such ideas across a range of areas. And this year, it was natural that we focus our attention on the COVID-19 pandemic. This year, the briefing book is titled Towards a Post-COVID India, and we have recommendations that span 5 themes: strengthening health systems, protecting the vulnerable, kickstarting the economy, making governance smart, and thinking digital first. So our conversation today is going to focus on one specific issue under the theme Protecting the Vulnerable, which is the question of making digital education inclusive. Now, while students all over have struggled with the rapid shift to online classes and the lack of internet access in particular has been a stumbling block, learners with disabilities have suffered disproportionately. So even in non-COVID times, inclusive education, which is a teaching system that is suitably adapted to meet the needs of learners with disabilities, remains a far cry. And we are only just beginning to understand the true impact of the pandemic on inclusive education. A survey published over the weekend by Swabhiman and the Disability Legislation Unit of the Eastern Chapter of the National Center for Promotion of Employment of Disabled People shows that almost more than 50% of learners with disabilities, from a sample size of approximately 2,000 students, said they were struggling, while 77% are afraid that they will not be able to cope and will fall behind because of a lack of accessibility. Now, our panel discussion, therefore, this evening is going to focus on what these challenges are and what needs to be done to make education more accessible. So we are delighted to have with us Mr. Subhash Chandra Vashishth, who is Director of Swayam, Global Center for Inclusive Environment, as well as a lawyer who litigates in the High Court, in the Delhi High Court and the Supreme Court of India. He's an access and inclusion specialist, a design thinker, and a disability and gender justice advocate. And he's also a member of the University Grants Commission Committee on Accessibility for Students with Disabilities. So we couldn't have asked for a better panelist. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Vashishth. I'm also very grateful to Ms. Preeti Sapra, who has joined us as a sign language interpreter. How we're going to structure today's discussion is by giving you an overview of the recommendations in Vidhi's briefing book on this particular topic. So Pooja Pandey, a research fellow with the Kotak Vidhi Inclusive Education Program and the author of this particular entry, will take us through the recommendations. Mr. Vashishth will respond, and we'll have a moderated discussion for about 20 minutes. And that will be followed at the end by a 10-minute Q&A. So I'll let Pooja begin by telling you what the entry is about and what some of our suggestions are. Over to you, Pooja.
Hi, thanks, Funny. Hi, everyone. So you have very well told us about the problem, the issues, and everybody everywhere has been talking a lot about the problem with digital education particularly. This entry gave us a chance to focus a little bit more on the solutions, and I would like to begin by saying that it will be wrong to say that the government is not doing anything. In fact, there are too many legislations and policies in place with respect to digital education somewhere. But the problem, however, is that it's very fragmented and it's in bits and pieces everywhere. So we have the national policy of ICT in school education, which is like a 2012 policy, which has a specific section on children with special needs, but it nowhere mentions about the earlier PWD Act and the current RPWD Act, or it doesn't confirm with the recent updated web content WCAG 2.0 guidelines. So it's a pretty outdated act. And there have been many other developments in the field of ICTs in education very rapidly from then on. Similarly, we also have a national policy on universal electronic accessibility, which also in bits and pieces talks about education somewhere. We have a wonderful guideline by TRI in 2018, which talks about making ICTs accessible for people with disability, of which a very important part is children with disabilities and their educational needs. So even that mentions about how can we make broadcasting TV units or cable or cell phone devices and things like these accessible. And the guideline has been wonderful laid out, but again, it's all in bits and pieces. So the first step that has to be done to sort of to sort of solve the problem is to bring everything in place and have a standardized guideline for digital education infrastructure for learners with disability. And again, see, this cannot happen in silo. So if the nodal ministry, which is the Ministry for Human Resource Development, cannot do it in silo, it has to keep other ministries like the Ministry of IT and Electronics and Department of Empowerment of People with Disability in account and involved from the very beginning, and that could be a new beginning. The second solution, which has been a far cry for a very, very long time, is that till date, despite the guidelines by TRI, many government websites and educational websites, private and public, are still not accessible for learners with disability. And a lot of people everywhere have been saying again and again that we need to make this accessible. So that has to be done for sure. And the other bit is the RTE Act. So the RTE Act, through its section 19 and 25, talks about norms and standards for a school. Now, if you read the section, it nowhere even keeps into its vocabulary digital infrastructure, which is like, from its very imagination, digital infrastructure is missing far to go for like accessible digital infrastructure. So that is something which has to be included in the RTE Act as well. So just to start with, these could be like the top 3 solutions to begin with. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pooja. And so what I'm picking up from this is that the problem really seems to be both fragmentation as well as a lack of implementation. And, so to pick up on one of the policies that you mentioned, the National Policy for ICT in School Education, there's a need to review and update it because it doesn't refer to the most up-to-date web content accessibility guidelines. Now, Mr. Vashishth, while updating the policy itself might be a necessary requirement, it's probably not sufficient. So what do you think are some of the major challenges for learners with disabilities during this time as far as online education goes? And how do we ensure that policies like this, once they are updated, are implemented correctly?
Wonderful. But I would begin by saying that let's take this pandemic as an opportunity to restructure our education. So, I mean, we should consider it as a blessing in disguise for the inclusion advocates and the education industry. It has actually shattered the education system completely, and this is the time to rebuild. All our old notions of education and the way we used to do the education are shattered. So, also we need to look at how the law has, used the term. The law says on an equal basis with others. So we can't really look at the education of disabled children in isolation. It has to be looked at as a whole. So, I mean, you can't have disabled children eating malai tikka and other students not getting on roti. So it has to be overall, because disabled students are a part of society. So we need to improve the whole system and then look at the needs of persons with disabilities with a lens of, say, universal design and learning and equipping all our infrastructure as accessible. I come to this ICT policy of the 2012 in education. I agree it's not updated to WCAG 2.1 level, which is like most advanced, which was issued in 2018. Just a sec, I think my battery was running low, and just a sec. Yeah, is that okay now? Okay, so it does refer to WCAG, so which is a good standard, and I agree it should keep updating. However, the policies remain, but the problem is that we don't allocate funds for implementation of those policies. So policies remain as a document on the website. There is no follow-up on the ground. The challenge also is that education is a state subject. The union government creates something, but then it is upon states to follow it up and states to look at how it is done, which is often, many states are actually not able to, because they have their own priorities, and the fund which is allocated to education is very low. So this is also a major challenge. This is also a major challenge. Other areas which I find is, the education for children with disabilities happens, if you look at the implementation, it is, you have parents as an important stakeholder, you have teachers as an important stakeholder, then you have schools. So these three are responsible for having right education. We don't have, the schools aren't prepared, the teachers are not trained. I mean, even today, if you look at the cases that we have in the High Court is appoint two special educators. I mean, they're not moving beyond those two special educators. We are not addressing the universal design and learning. We are not addressing how education curriculum needs to be imparted to students and how students need to be included. We are just stuck with just we need to have two special educators. So there's a whole system that actually needs to change. Uh, Other thing is, we have a procurement policy. We still do not have a appropriate procurement policy in various ministries, that we are getting all everything accessible. They try recommendations. We worked so hard. I'm so entire disability sector had worked so hard on it, but it seems it remained recommendations. The interministry. I mean, Pooja had rightly pointed out that HRD ministry is not a part of it. I mean, we need to have HRD ministry as a part of it. Similarly, we got a best law. As I said, section 42, we have not actually implemented. It needs to be implemented. We need to have policies, we need to have bylaws, we need to have rules so that it goes on to the ground. That's not going. We also need convergence. The challenge is we have things in isolation. We have various laws in isolation, but there's no convergence happening. I looked at Prime Minister's e-Vidya platform, but this is supported by DTH, but DTH is only one way. So it's only communicating through, say, where there is no internet penetration. So you have this through satellite, but is how the doubts of children with disabilities or learners with disabilities is going to be resolved. There has to be a connecting mechanism for students. So they can't, you can't ensure their complete learning through one way, audios or videos. This really will not work. Similarly, Pooja has also rightly pointed out that we need to update also Right to Education Act, because this is still revolving around physical infrastructure of the schools. So that really needs to. So for me, I think budgets are important. How states are allocating their budgets. We got best of policies. Of course, there are certain cracks that we can always fill in, but the funds need to come in. Education need to get the priorities that and the technology. On the field, the major challenge that we are finding right now is the penetration of internet, because most of the schools are gone online. The parents do not know how to use the technology. Even if they know, they don't have funds to get an additional mobile phone, which can be kept at home. The father has a phone, father goes to the work, and at home there is completely, there is no, so government has to, I think my suggestion or the way forwards are that we need to include empowering the parents, empowering teachers. We need to maybe issue tablets, issue technology to students free of cost, maybe under a DIP scheme, maybe under various other government schemes, but students need to be supported. So that, and then we need to, all these ministries, I do not agree that just it's the question or is the responsibility of DPW or the Minister of Social Justice. Education has to be addressed by Ministry of HRD and the mainstream education ministries. They can't just wash their hands away to say that it has, we did not get their support. It's only a facilitating ministry. It can help and facilitate. The main functions have to be undertaken by the nodal ministries, and nodal ministry is HRD. So the HRD has to take up this as a big time task. One area that I have is there's a difference. The difference is I'm making ICT accessible. So in that you make websites accessible, you make content accessible, you harness ICT innovatively, so that you provide student support services. All your books, ebooks are available on your website. You have digital learning resources available. You got digital repositories for students and teachers on the website. Other is delivery of online classes. So these two things are, pretty different, and very often we confuse these two. So one is we have standards available, where all things are accessible, available on the website. Everybody is able to use it. It is available in different formats. So it's available in, say, sign language, it's available in captions, it's available in explained videos. So that needs to be accessible. And then the students have data, students have good connectivity or mobile, tablet, computers, and teachers, students, and everybody is trained. So this is the approach that perhaps we need to undertake.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vashishth. I think there are a lot of very concrete suggestions in there, and I hope the right people are listening to this. Since you've pointed out what some of the things are that the government is doing, Pooja, perhaps you could shed light on what some of the best practices at this time have been. Who is getting it right? Which state governments have come up with innovative solutions? Are there other countries that are managing to do a better job of this? It would be good to hear about that.
Sure. So this pandemic has brought a lot of surprise for everybody, and this is not a surprise for us as well. So all the countries are experimenting with their education, and it's good to see that a lot of countries are experimenting in very different ways. If we talk about India in particular, Kerala, as always, is doing a good job. So the DTH penetration, what we've been talking about, and Sir was also mentioning the PME with their program. So in that, Kerala is also doing that. They're providing classes like teaching online on television, and in places where there are no television in houses, they're having community centers, so the kids can go to the community centers and then like have a collaborative learning environment that way. They've also sort of mobilized CSOs and parents to donate televisions in places where like there's no availability of television particularly. And meanwhile, what they did was to, before implementing these particular initiatives, they did a survey from school to school, having a very good sense of how many kids have mobile, how many kids have data connection, how many have television. It came out that 93% people have access to television. So that came out to be the best mode to have education. This is not particularly for children with special need, but in general, it's an education innovation. And all around the world, again, many things are happening. Some of the things which I think can be adopted in India is some countries like Argentina, Bhutan, Jamaica, what they're doing is they're collaborating and partnering with telecom companies, and they're having like zero paid net. So for education website, if you serve those websites, you don't have to pay for it. So in that case, for people who cannot really access it or afford it, it becomes an easy option. Then countries like Bermuda, like they're giving different kind of guidelines to parents and caregivers to deal with this difficult time, because again, it's not just the children who are involved, it is also the parents and the caregivers who are equally involved in this process of education at the current moment. And then in other places like Finland, they are identifying some very active teacher group on Facebook or other social media groups, tapping those resources, piloting some of the schemes first for them, and then initiating it in other places. So just to name a few, these were the things. And World Bank and UNESCO and organizations like these are maintaining wonderful resources on like such best practices, and this can be accessed by anybody. So
that's very useful to know. So I'll ask Pooja a quick question before I go back to Mr. Vashishth about to talk about the RP, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. So Pooja, what are learners with disabilities and their parents and other stakeholders currently doing to draw the attention of government to this issue of lack of accessibility?
Okay, I will not say that a lot is happening, but something around the corner is happening in some way or the other. So you must have heard in the news that there was a PIL petition filed by some law students in Delhi High Court that these online exams that you're taking is not conducive for people with visual impairments or hearing impairments. Similarly, there are like in the beginning you were mentioning about a survey through a CSO, an organization like that. So different organizations are conducting surveys like this. Something like this, even Vidhi is planning to do with like a cluster of organizations in South India. Like we are planning to do that kind of a survey with Ekta, Rural Development Trust, and other organizations to understand how different states in Southern India, that is Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, how are these states dealing with digital education for children with special needs, and what are the current policies they're having. So this could also act as a comparative study, and then again case study for other stakeholders in other states and other areas. So
yes, I think it's important to study the effectiveness of state interventions, but it's also important to understand what the potential role of the law can be. So that's where I'll come back to you, Mr. Vashishth, to get your sense on what you see as the role of the law in guaranteeing access to inclusive education, as in more specifically, how should people be using the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act as a strategic legal and advocacy tool at the moment?
I'm so glad that you raised this question. The Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act is a fairly new law. Of course, then the sector was involved in it and they're aware of it, but this has not really seen a lot of implementation. Still, there are the organizations, advocates, inclusion advocates, and the DPOs are fighting, and making a noise with the ministry to come out with policies and come out with schemes. In fact, I can tell you many of the sections remain unimplemented even today. If you talk of, just the section 42 that we were discussing. So the section 42.
Have we lost Mr. Vashishth?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. We'll wait for a couple of minutes, but in the meantime, perhaps I'll just, please do post your questions on the chat box. We already have a few, and I'll begin reading them out so people get a sense of what everyone else is asking. So one of the questions, and actually this is something that I wanted to bring up with Mr. Vashishth, was to look at what the role of private parties can be in ensuring accessible digital education. So how can the state government push private parties towards making this kind of educational content available accessibly online? And the other question is one about, and I'll repeat this when Mr. Vashishth is back. But how do we meet the challenge of designing a comprehensive inclusive education program for learners with disabilities, given that there are so many different kinds of disabilities? So I think that's a very important question, and it would be good to hear what Mr. Vashishth has to say on this when he's back. In the meantime, Pooja, do you want to speak a little bit about the HRD ministry guidelines, the Pragyata guidelines that they've issued? What do they say about education for children with disabilities?
Yeah, so firstly, it's a good thing that they've mentioned a separate section for children with special needs, and they've just given two very small sections on that particularly, where they've talked about, they have already existing resources on NCERT with a lot of audiobooks and then things like that. So they've asked in the guideline to make use of those audiobooks. Then of course, DTH and everything using television, which as Swayam has launched 2 channels, which is going to specifically cater to children with visual impairment and hearing impairment. So they've asked to use all of that. They've allowed for flexible schedules. So they've allowed that kind of a flexibility for teachers in assessing like the homework, the classwork, and also giving some kind of flexibility to the caregiver and parents also in doing that. One of the good things which I personally felt was they've mentioned very explicitly in the guidelines that at most, please do not try to segregate the education regime of all the children. Whatever you're doing, try to have a more inclusive class, which gives a good signal. But then again, the kind of question which was just raised by you, they've in a way just catered to very specific kind of disabilities, and that is locomotor disability, and they've talked probably about visual impairments and hearing impairment. Other disabilities like intellectual disabilities, etc., have not been catered to that much. And when it comes to education, they've just talked about online education, classroom education, nothing around rehabilitation or other therapy needs and things like that.
Right.
So that's where the guidelines sort of has a setback.
Sure. No, that's useful to know, because it's also hard to keep track of all the various initiatives and policies and guidelines that have been issued so far. As you said, there's the eVidya platform. Yeah. There are separate state schemes. There is a national ICT policy. I think this really goes back to the point you made at the beginning of the discussion about the need to, at least for the sake of simplicity, bring all of this together under one umbrella. And again, the challenge, as Mr. Vashishth mentioned, is to ensure that this is not just something that is seen as in the province of the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, but a requirement and a need that is mainstreamed through all the other departments and ministries that deal with this as well.
Yes.
So Mr. Vashishth seems to be having some internet difficulties. And so you can imagine what it must be like for students who are trying to access classes like this. In fact, there was a very, I think the incident that sparked a lot of, that created a lot of outrage in Kerala was when a young student committed suicide, allegedly because she was unable to access her online classes. So Pooja, what have been some of the state government reactions to this? As in, I understand that in Karnataka, the idea was to try and decide to decide not to have online education, given that it couldn't be made accessible to everyone. Oh.
I'm so sorry. I just suddenly lost the connection. So
no problem, Mr. Vashishth. We were just taking some of the questions that had been posted, but please do go ahead and finish the thought that you were telling us about just before you lost connectivity.
Yeah. See, any law, I mean, I remember my law professor always used to say the law, I mean, it's very absurd, but then law is an ass, it needs a kick in order to work. So you always need to put the law into action, and otherwise it can remain in shelf book for years together. So this is a time when we should use the law, constructively. And I have one more caution, because we have this rushed, we immediately rush to the courts with, these problems. Absolutely. But courts, we have to understand that even courts do not have answers. So you have to go with proper research, with proper, views of the stakeholders as to what is the solution in light of these policies. So whenever we go to court, we should have a very constructive solution which the court can consider and ask the government to consider it. Otherwise, it's always back and forth, and the way policies are brought out, they don't have any impact during implementation. So this is one of my advice, which all lawyers, young lawyers can do it. The activists should do it. And in fact, our Disability Act is a very good, I would say, a document which we can use every section to litigate and to bring down the best that is possible for persons with disabilities. It has not been happening so far, and a few cases have come up on access and education and few other areas, but we need to do more experiments with this.
Great. I couldn't agree with you more about the need to approach courts with caution and with a constructive solution. So with that, I'm going to take some of the questions that I was mentioning earlier. One is, someone has asked whether private parties can be invited to help implement the mandate of inclusive digital education better. So what do you have to say to that, Mr. Vashishth? How do we get private parties on board? Because there are a lot of people currently, private parties, producing this kind of online educational material. So how do we make sure that they also comply with accessibility guidelines?
All right. I think this question has been raised by many parents whose children are going to private schools, and very often private schools have their own course curriculum. They don't really follow what the government has, and also they are hosting this on their own platforms, which are very often not accessible. But let me tell you, education is as a service within the law. It has to be accessible. So we can always enforce this law on private parties as well, who are providing a public function like education. So this is one part of the question. The other question perhaps is, how do we include private people who want to help? Yes. So definitely that is something which is, as a private player, of course I can, but this can be done at local, SMC level in the school. For example, there's a group who's available with these services. So they can do maybe pilot with the school management committees. Of course, they have to get in touch with the school management committees and say that this is a solution and this is in line with the mandate. And once the pilot is successful, I'm sure then this can be implemented at a larger scale by the ministries. Government are very open. It's not the government are closed. They want to do things, and they're very happy when private initiatives come up to them, and they want to solve the problems and make life easier for people. So I don't think there is any government is always welcoming such initiatives.
No, that's a great idea. The point about school management committees, particularly, I think is really one to take on board. We have a comment from Carmo Narona, who talks about the turf war between the HRD and the MSJE. And I'm not entirely sure if there's a question in there, but yeah, perhaps that's a point worth noting as well. How do we allocate responsibilities across these two ministries in a reasonable manner to ensure that inclusive education is not neglected? There's another, so I mean, of course, you can comment on that if you like, Mr. Vashishth, or
Okay.
I move on to the next question.
Let me come to this question in a little more wholesome way. We have several ministries which are looking at the interest of marginalized segments. For example, you got social justice, you got Ministry of Tribal Affairs, which is looking at the interests of tribal children. So it does talk about education of the tribal children, and this ministry called. But we have to come, we have to come to the nodal ministry. Nodal ministry is responsible for education of all children in the country. We cannot bifurcate that tribal children will be looked after by Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and disabled children will be looked after by Ministry of Social Justice. These ministries they know of specific requirements of children with disabilities. They have connects with DPOs who are working. For example, in tribal ministry, they're working with tribals. These NGOs are working. So ministries does give a lot of funds to those NGOs or organizations, non-profit organizations to work with tribals. So there's a network that is available with that ministry. So with that, they have a reach. So they can always leverage that reach and that resourcefulness to help Ministry of HRD. But the nodal work has to be with Ministry of HRD only, all the nodal ministries in the state to look at the education. Others can always bring in a kind of support and expertise.
Absolutely. That sounds, I wish these suggestions could be taken on board and implemented in this constructive manner. We have one more question from, and we are a little over time, but we will take a few more questions, if that's okay, Mr. Vashishth.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a question from Mr. Sudeep Goyal, who says that learners with intellectual and developmental disabilities require intense physical and verbal prompting. So how do we optimize digital education for this section of learners?
That's a wonderful question. I too had commented in my initial thoughts that the worst affected students are students with IDD, that's called intellectual and developmental disabilities. For this, I had actually said that we need to have parents on board. So when we may need contact. I mean, contactless will not work for such children. You need some contact. You need some prompt. So parents do come up. Parents' role does come up. You have siblings' roles come up especially when students are at home. So they also need to be involved. They also need to be empowered. And schools need to look at this as an option, because schools cannot reach everybody's home. Though a requirement is that there's a special educator which comes home once in a while, so 15 days. But I don't know how possible it is during the pandemic, and how many students, because of the spread of the students in so many areas, we don't have those many, that much expertise. But in such situation, the best is to involve parents and siblings who could be trained and who could be utilized for not only classes, but also for exams and for other evaluations. And it is not a cheating, let me tell you, because a lot of schools say, no, you will not say anything. The family members will not say anything. You're helping the child. No, they're not helping. They're only prompting. So each child has a different requirement, and that needs to be considered in this digital inclusion as well.
Absolutely. I think this question about the need for sort of personalized interventions had come up even at a webinar that Vidhi had organized earlier this year to discuss, the challenges of children with special needs as well as special educators at this time. And if anyone is interested, please do go back and look at our YouTube section to see how so we have teachers there who've commented on the different steps they're taking to address this particular problem. There's a very interesting question about, the permanence of digital education. So you mentioned, Mr. Vashishth, at the beginning that the pandemic has been disruptive for education. But someone points out that, there are several state governments, including, for example, the Kerala Chief Minister, who has pointed out that digital education is only intended as an online or is only intended as a temporary policy measure. So what do they see it as a bridge until they can go back to the resumption of, physical classes and, sort of normal school, so supposedly normal school environments. So how would you respond to this?
Well, I would say this is going to stay, and this has gained a more, I would say, credibility, because so far all distance education was considered as second class. They were not given, proper respect, and all NIO students were not even considered in a lot of higher education to say that no, these are all private students, so they won't. This has created credibility of online system, and this is here to stay. It's not I don't consider it as a temporary phase, and this is an opportunity for us to make it inclusive and make it something which is not just useful for person with disabilities. It helps in a whole sector. It works working people. It helps people who can't really step out because of their personal health conditions. So it's irrespective of accessibility being provided. You don't have a family member to go along with you, or you don't have your health doesn't your health doesn't permit you to go and attend a class. So this is a huge blessing, and I think we should look at accessibility of this in this opportune time. And I believe this is going to stay here. Absolutely.
Right. Right. That's an interesting and certainly different perspective from that of some of the state governments. So let's see how they respond as the pandemic unfolds and we realize that this is perhaps this kind of education is here to stay. I'm going to take two final questions. One is asking, there's someone asking you, Mr. Vashishth, to enlighten them on how sections 16 and 27 of the RPWD Act can be used to obtain inclusive education.
Just a sec, because it's like I just need to get hold of the law. I'm so sorry.
So no problem. So I actually do have the law open in front of me. So Section 16 is about the duty of educational institutions that are funded or recognized by the government to provide inclusive education to children with disabilities. And there's a whole list of specific measures under there. And I think Section 27 is about rehabilitation, asking the appropriate government to, they've clarified that it's Section 17. Again, this is specific measures that the government should take to promote and facilitate inclusive education. Maybe I can post these sections in the chat box for everyone.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've opened section 16. See, the duty of education institutions, as I said, no school is now denying any child with disability for admission. So this is the effect of this law, that most of the schools have been, they have become aware because of notices from the various state commissioners or from the parents, telling them the duty of education institutions under section 16. So they have stopped refusing admissions. But the challenge is whether the building has been made accessible. The challenge is whether reasonable accommodation has been provided. So there is a huge scope of, I see, not only working with the school, but also of litigation. Right. And also of creating policies by the government to support such initiatives, because very often the schools are just left at their own to fend for themselves. Whereas for private schools, or for say government schools also, or the schools run by municipality, they don't have funding to make things accessible. They don't have funding to provide this reasonable accommodation. So I think central government or the state government need to come up with those schemes that this reasonable accommodation, for example, a child needs a tablet. So if school doesn't have funds, school can't provide it, can it be provided under a state scheme? So, and this can be done if it is a government school, it can be, because it is the duty of the appropriate government and the local authorities. So whoever is running that school could utilize that scheme to provide that reasonable accommodation to their child. And for making school and facilities accessible, I think the government of India had already started the accessibility campaign, which has gone to some extent, but then now it is again on various states and institutions to look at how they can provide accessibility say in 5 years time or in 3 years time. Organizations are reacting. I mean, they're reacting at the last moment. They did not plan when the act came. The act has given 5 years. So in these 5 years, you need to chalk out an accessibility plan, what they will do each year. So maybe in their annual maintenance plan, they could address some of the accessibility issues. And in a major renovation, they could even seek fund from CSR or from ministries or from their own funds. But this is a legal requirement. They need to make it.
That's very helpful. I think, though, again, very specific, helpful suggestions, Mr. Vashishth, on how to effectively realize the letter of the law. I'm going to end with one last question. Again, this seems to be one about turf issues. And this is actually something that Vidhi has been grappling with as well. The question is, if education is the province of the MHRD ministry, then is of the MHRD, then why are special educators governed by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment? Why does the Rehabilitation Council of India also continue to be under the Social Justice and Empowerment Ministry? This is a question from Gautam Chaudhary.
If you ask me as a person, I would say we don't need RCI.
Okay.
We actually don't need RCI.
Okay.
RCI was brought in at a time when there was a huge vacuum and you needed certain organizations to look at these interests. But when today more things are mainstreaming, we don't need specific institutions. We need to empower NCRT. We need to empower AICTE. We need to empower mainstream institutions to have inclusion within their systems, so that you have every educator being prepared to deal with all disabilities. Basic requirements. See how education happens. For a simple law graduate, you do simple LLB, and then you specialize into a certain area. You don't do a special LLB into only disability law, right? You do LLB and then you practice any law in the areas that you want to. So all teachers must be trained in inclusive education and UDL, basically Universal Design and Learning, so that they're able to address the needs of diverse learners. And wherever specialized this thing is there, there'll be always experts. For example, in medicine, you have experts. In law, we have textual experts, we have various experts. So the experts will continue to play the role, but this must rest with Ministry of HRD and the mainstream institutions. Otherwise, I can tell you for next 20 years also, this is going to continue. And this exclusion will continue to happen. There will be never an inclusion of persons with disabilities. How many seminars we do, and how much, how many PRs we file.
Absolutely. And I think that's the lesson that we're taking away from this webinar today, which is that there really needs to be a greater sensitization about how to mainstream these requirements into all areas of life, whether it be education, employment, access to justice. For example, there's a comment from Masoom Raza on the Surendra Mohan judgment, which restricted the eligibility of blind and deaf candidates to be appointed as judges in Tamil Nadu. So, I think they might perhaps be having doubts about the role of the judiciary in light of that judgment. So there's a lot of sensitization and awareness required across the board. Lots of constructive solutions are out there. It's, we can see that innovative state governments are listening to those suggestions, taking them up and acting on them. So there are there are governments and public authorities that are showing the way. So this is something that can be done, but obviously requires a concerted investment of funds, human resources, and training. So thank you very much to everyone for tuning in today. Thank you very much, Mr. Vashishth. I think there were some really useful suggestions in there, which we are looking forward to going back and discussing. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our interpreter, Preeti, for doing such a wonderful job over the last 45 minutes. And to the audience and everyone who tuned in for engaging with us and sending us your questions. Please do feel free to write into us if you have any more questions that you would like us to answer, any suggestions or ideas you have for furthering research and advocacy in this area. There's Pooja's email address in the chat box, so please do write into her. And I hope that we can continue to have a constructive dialogue on this issue. Do remember to tune in for our 5th conversation series on Wednesday, the 24th of July at 5:30 p.m. We're going to be discussing the environment and the need for a wildlife protection authority with Dr. Fayaz Khudsar of the Yamuna Biodiversity Park. So anyone who's interested, it should be an entertaining discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.